Hi, welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm George and welcome to my art studio. Today I'm going to be painting a commissioned portrait of a dog called Rocco. So one thing I've found being a professional artist is that it really helps if you can get good at painting portraits of dogs as well as people, because no matter what you enjoy painting, whether that's landscapes or big narrative paintings like the one behind me, I find I always get a lot of regular work doing commissioned portraits and commissioned pet portraits. Today I'm going to share with you my process and some tips on how to paint a dog. If you are going to take on a commission portrait of a dog from a photograph, definitely ask your client for quite a few different pictures. Part of the reason for that is you can look through and find which one looks best, and you can consider the lighting and the composition, the position of the dog. For example, this one here, the photo is taken in natural light, so I've got a nice simple one directional light source, clear lights and clear shadows, and a nice sparkle in the dog's eye. First off, I'm just using my computer screen as my reference. The reason why I'm using a screen rather than printing the image out is because the colours come up a lot nicer on a screen, and also I can change the exposure, I can make it lighter or darker, I can boost the saturation, and I can zoom in quite close as well when I need to paint smaller details. The first step is I'm going to do the underdrawing onto the panel, and then I'm going to start painting. So please do subscribe to my channel, and let's start painting this dog called Rocco. I start by marking the height and width of the dog on my panel using a charcoal pencil. It's important to mark these points first to establish where I want the dog to be positioned on the panel. This way I avoid the risk of having the dog too close to the edge, or even worse, running out of space to fit the dog onto the panel, and this can happen if you jump into the details too soon before marking in the overall proportions. To draw the proportions accurately, I'm using a technique known as comparative measurement, which involves checking the measurements against the different sections of my reference photo, such as the width of the head compared to the height. And what I'm trying to find is sections within the photo which have the same measurement, so that I can make a mental note of this and then check when I place the marks on my painting that the proportions bear the same relationships. For example, from the top of Rocco's head to the top of his mouth, it's the same distance as the width of his head from the inside of his ears. And I can check these measurements by lining the end of my pencil up with what I'm measuring and moving my thumb down the pencil to line up with the bottom of what I'm measuring. And keeping my thumb in the same position, I can move my pencil over different areas of my reference photo and check if this measurement is the same as other areas throughout the photo. And although the scale of my painting and my photo reference are different, the proportional relationships remain the same. And as I sketch these proportions, I try and keep the lines simple and straight, as I need to be prepared to move and change these lines right up until they're in the exact right position. I find it's easier to be more specific with straight lines than curved lines at this early stage in the drawing. As I sketch, I start to add a bit of shade to the dark sections in the photo, such as Rocco's eyes and nose, as by adding some tonal value, the shapes become easier to see and the proportional errors become more clear and easier to judge. I also get a bit more specific with the small shapes and subtle angle breaks within the contours. And as I draw, I'm using my putty rubber, which I can mould into different shapes to remove any marks which are placed incorrectly. Once I'm satisfied with my underdrawing, I add some thinned down oil paint to paint the darkest shadows in the painting. I'm using a colour mix of ultramarine blue, raw umber and a touch of ivory black. And I'm applying the paint with a fine filbert brush made by Rosemary & Co. from their Ivory range. I'm also thinning the paint using Sansidor, which is a low odour mineral spirit. The main reason why I apply the paint as a thin wash at this stage is that it allows for the paint to dry quickly, meaning it will be easier for me to paint on top of this with subtler shifts in colour and value later on. It also allows me to cover these sections quickly. And once I've got this section covered, I'm going to make some paint mixes on my palette for different sections of the painting. On my palette I'm using titanium white, cadmium yellow, pyrrole red, which is similar to cadmium red, alizarin crimson, raw umber, yellow ochre, cerulean blue, ultramarine blue and ivory black. And I may add some permanent green as well, especially when I'm painting in the grass in the background. And here I'm just going to mix a few colours before I start layering in the areas on the painting. So for the areas, the lightest lights, I'm actually going to use pure white. I don't always do this, but because the dog is really white, I'm going to use that. For the lightest sections, just pure titanium white. And then the other sections I'm going to use a slightly warmer white. So I'm adding a bit of raw umber and yellow ochre into the colour mix. And I'm just going to add a tiny bit of ultramarine blue. As there are some golden brownish colours in Rocco's hair. I'm also going to make a cooler light half tone. Adding a bit of ultramarine blue, a bit of ivory black, and then a bit of raw umber yellow ochre. Let's see how. This tone is going to sit close to the shadow edges to help turn the form. The darkest darks I'm going to use ivory black, some raw umber as well, some alizarin crimson. I never like to use pure black, I always like to try and add a bit of colour to it. And alizarin crimson is a very transparent red, so it works quite nicely. And one of the sections of colour on the painting which is most chromatic is the tongue on the dog, so I'm going to add a bit of pyrrole red, titanium white, it's quite pinkish, so a bit of blue, a bit of yellow. I don't want to paint it too chromatic. There's the sort of shadow above the tongue. I'm going to use alizarin crimson and raw umber for that. Yeah, and those are a few colour mixes that I'm going to go back to and add to as I paint. But notice I'm using my palette knife to pick up the paint and then mix the colours so I get nice clean mixes without having to put my brush into each pile of paint. Now that I've established the darkest darks in the painting, I'm now painting the very lightest sections using pure titanium white. By establishing my darkest dark and my lightest light, it gives me a key that I can work with by referencing all my tonal values against these. To paint the lighter sections, I'm using a broader filbert brush than that which I use to paint the dark areas. And I always find it's important when painting very light areas or very dark areas to use two different brushes, as when you use one brush to paint the darks, if you try and use that brush to paint the light sections, some of that dark paint can still be stuck in the hairs of the brush and it can darken that light paint as you put it onto your canvas. I'm also not thinning this light paint with any medium, as I want to paint the light areas quite thickly to give these sections some more interesting brushwork, as well as trying to capture the texture of the hair. In general, to create a realistic 3D appearance in your painting, I would recommend painting the shadows thinly so that the brushwork is less visible, which prevents the light from catching on the paint strokes in the shadows, which can give the appearance of light dashing within the shadows and can kind of break up the unity of the shadows. Having this thicker impasto brushwork in the lights also helps draw the viewer's eyes to those sections which in nature is where our eyes are naturally drawn to. As the human eye does not see a scene or an object all in sharp focus when we look at it, our eyes are normally drawn to the areas of high contrast. With this in mind, we can use this to dictate the focal point of our painting, as well as remembering not to over-render and sharpen every detail as we paint, as this in fact can make the painting less realistic, and sometimes it's what you leave out which makes the painting more real than what you add in. I'm now using a different paint mix, which is a combination of titanium white with a touch of raw umber and yellow ochre to paint these sections of light golden brown in Rocco's hair. Here I'm repainting the dark areas using a colour mix of ivory black with a touch of alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. To paint the nose, I then paint a lighter half-tone around the shadow edge to help turn the form, and I add a thicker highlight using titanium white and ultramarine blue with a small touch of raw umber just to neutralise the chroma of the blue slightly. I'm now painting a cool grey halftone around the shadow of Rocco's mouth. At this stage I'm trying to simplify the form of the dog's head, and I'm not focusing on the small shapes within the hair. This halftone helps turn the form to give the head a 3D structure. And in general, when painting, you want to prioritise the form over detail, as the form created through tonal values is what will prevent your painting from looking flat and 2D. So Rocco's tail has a warmer brown colour than the rest of his body, so I start by painting the darkest sections in the middle of his tail. Then I add the slightly lighter sections around this, overlapping the brush strokes between these different transitions to create a soft effect. To paint the tongue, I start by painting the darkest sections, which are in the shadow cast by the dog's mouth. I use a colour mix consisting mostly of alizarin crimson, raw umber, and a touch of ultramarine blue and titanium white. I'm now painting the mid-tone values using mostly pyrrole red and titanium white, with some alizarin crimson and a little bit of ultramarine blue and a touch of yellow ochre. To paint the lightest lights on the tongue, I use the same colour combination as that which I use for the mid-tones, but I add a bit more titanium white to the mix. As titanium white isn't completely neutral in colour temperature, it does cool down the colour mix slightly, and it also makes it slightly less chromatic. Using a round brush with a fine point, I'm now painting this shiny highlight in Rocco's eye. For me, this is the funnest bit of this painting, as with just this small dab of white paint, the portrait really comes to life, and it gives the eye that shiny, lifelike appearance. My advice when painting highlights in the eye is to avoid the temptation to paint the highlight too big, as just a small, well-placed dab does the trick best. Also, I apply the paint with a brush stroke going in one direction and remove the paintbrush from the surface at the end of the stroke to avoid going back and forth with the white paint, which will cause the paint to mix with the darks in the pupil and the iris, which will give the eye a grey, cloudy appearance, which isn't what we want. So it's important to keep those brush strokes distinct, as it's that sharp contrast between the light brush stroke and the surrounding dark values which will give the eye that shiny appearance. Now I'm painting Rocco's bright orange collar using a colour mix of pyrrole red, cadmium yellow and a touch of titanium white. And as the collar gets lower under Rocco's head, I use a colour mix with less titanium white, as the collar turns away from the light source of the sky, it takes on a slightly darker tonal value. And for the sections of the collar which are completely facing towards the ground, they're therefore in shadow, and the colour mix for this I use raw umber and alizarin crimson. To paint this little ball in the grass, I can use some of the exact same colour mix that I used on his collar, which helps add a bit of unity throughout the painting. Here I'm adding some of the darkest accents within the grass which surround Rocco. And as the scene is getting lit mostly from above and slightly to the left, the areas underneath Rocco and to the right of him will be cast in shadow. Also, as there's a lot of grass in this painting, I need to be careful in my approach to painting this, as I want to keep the main focal point as the dog and not let the grass get too distracting. I also want to keep the darkest sections of contrast in the grass as the areas closest to Rocco, and create a softer diffused effect the further away I get from the centre of the painting. This helps draw the viewer's eye into the painting and bring extra focus to Rocco, as our eyes are naturally drawn to areas of tonal contrast. Here I'm picking out some of the finer details in a few individual blades of grass, and as I mentioned earlier, it isn't necessary to paint every single blade of grass in a photorealistic detail in order to create a realistic impression of the grass. However, I find it does help to paint a few areas very accurately with a keen attention to detail, and as a result the human eye will fill in the rest of the grass subconsciously. So here I'm adding a lighter highlight to this blade of grass, and I'm also carving out the contour with the shadow value of ultramarine blue, raw umber and a touch of cadmium yellow. I'm also changing a few of the shapes within the grass to contribute to the overall compositional design. As I'm trying to keep the focal point of the painting as Rocco the dog, I can use a few prominent blades of grass to point towards Rocco, which in effect works as arrows leading the viewer's eyes back to him. So the key to painting these metallic buckles and the tag on Rocco's collar, it's all about painting the majority of the buckle quite dark in tonal value and adding a very light highlight with a small dab of well-positioned paint. This instantly creates that shiny metal appearance, much like when I put that light highlight into Rocco's eye. And to do this, you really have to just trust the process and apply the highlight in a simple, direct, singular brushstroke without fiddling too much, which would cause the light and dark paint to blend, and as a result you would lose that sharp contrast between the light and the dark value which occurs on metallic objects. Using a fine pointed round brush, I'm now adding some of those subtle details into Rocco's hair. When painting these fine details, it's important not to lose sight of the overall value structure of the painting, as although there are shifts in tonal value between certain strands of hair and the shadows that they cast, you should be careful not to overstate these, as this can cause your painting to look over-modelled and dirty, and for that reason it's helpful to still squint to your reference and remember to try and group the values into lights, halftones and shadows. And this will help you keep that strong sense of form and unity throughout the painting. So I finished the painting of Rocco and I'm happy with how it turned out. I hope you enjoyed my video and that seeing my process was useful for you. If it was, please do give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can also give me a super thanks where you can click on that little heart symbol with a $sign, and there you have the option of giving as little as £2 to my YouTube channel, which I'd be really grateful for. So there are a few final steps that I'm going to take before I give this painting to my client. I'm going to make a new YouTube video taking you through those steps which I do, from framing to varnishing. It's really important you use the right sort of varnish for the painting, and putting a certificate of authenticity on the back, and a few small things that I do before I give the painting to the client. So if that sounds interesting, keep an eye out for that video. It probably will take me a few weeks before I post that video. And if you're watching this video after I've posted it, then that video will be linked at the end of this one. So thanks for watching. You can follow me on Instagram at George Frederick Thomas, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.